In 2026, Leo sat alone at his kitchen table. No expensive house, no huge backyard, no garage full of tools he barely used. Just a rented apartment, a cup of coffee going cold beside his elbow, and a laptop open in front of him, cursor blinking on an empty spreadsheet he'd been avoiding for years. He was 40 years old, and he was still renting. Outside his window, he could hear his neighbor's kids playing in the parking lot below. The same sound he'd heard almost every evening for the past 3 years. He'd moved apartments 4 times in 15 years. Different neighborhoods, different cities even. Once for a job, once because the rent got too high, once just because he wanted something closer to work. Each move had felt small at the time. Looking back now, they added up to a very different kind of life than the one his friends had built. He opened his investments account and stared at the number on the screen for a long moment before scrolling further, cross-referencing it against another tab, another set of numbers he'd pulled from a mortgage calculator and a home value estimator earlier that afternoon. For 15 years, Leo had been told he was doing life wrong. His parents told him renting was throwing money away. His coworkers told him he needed to buy before prices climbed even higher. His friends told him he was going to regret it. And for a long time, if you'd asked Leo honestly, late at night, without any pride in the way, he thought they might be right. To understand how he got to that kitchen table, we have to go back to when Leo was 25. He lived in an ordinary American city. Not Manhattan, not Beverly Hills, just the kind of place where young professionals try to build something out of nothing. A mid-sized city with a decent job market, a handful of breweries downtown, and housing prices that felt high but not yet absurd. Leo made around $65,000 a year, which sounded like a decent number until taxes, insurance, retirement contributions, and everyday expenses quietly ate most of it before it ever reached his checking account. He had $30,000 in savings that he'd built up slowly since college, a stack of student loans that seemed to shrink by inches, and a used car with a check engine light he ignored more than he should have. There was rent, groceries, a health insurance premium that increased every January like clockwork, and the occasional emergency that always seemed to show up right after payday, as if it had been waiting. One Saturday, Leo went house hunting with his parents. They'd insisted, the way parents do when they've decided something is overdue. They found a place listed around $300,000. A modest 3-bedroom with a decent yard, a driveway, a kitchen that needed updating but had good bones, as the realtor kept saying. His mom loved it immediately, walking from room to room, narrating where furniture would go. His dad walked through the garage, ran his hand along a workbench that wasn't even his yet, and said this was the kind of place you build a life in. For a moment, standing in that empty living room with afternoon light coming through the windows, Leo could see it too. A wife, kids, a dog running across a backyard, Christmas mornings with a real fireplace instead of a radiator clanking in the corner of an apartment. Then he sat in his car afterward and looked at what the monthly payment would actually be. And the picture got a lot more complicated, because the mortgage wasn't the only number. There was property tax, which alone would run him several $100s a month. Homeowner's insurance, maintenance that never really stops once you own something. A furnace that eventually needs replacing. A roof with a shelf life, a water heater that picks the worst possible week to fail. Utilities that scale with square footage instead of shrinking to fit an apartment. Closing costs that would eat thousands of dollars before he even got the keys. And before any of that, a down payment that would swallow most of what he'd spent years carefully saving. Leo realized that buying this house would mean putting almost everything he had into a single asset, all at once, right at the start of his career, with almost nothing left over as a cushion. So he made a decision that disappointed his parents. He didn't buy. He rented. A smaller 2-bedroom across town. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. And far cheaper than the mortgage would have been. His dad asked him, not unkindly, what his plan was, sitting across from him at their kitchen table a few weeks later. Leo said he'd invest the difference. His dad laughed, not cruelly, just the way a parent laughs when they think their kid doesn't quite understand how the world works yet. He told Leo you can't live in a stock market account. That sentence stuck with Leo for years, replaying at odd moments, usually late at night when doubt crept in. But Leo didn't walk away from that conversation with a slogan. He didn't tell himself renting was better than buying. Full stop. End of discussion. That distinction mattered more than he realized at the time. Instead, he made one simple rule for himself. If renting cost less than owning would, he'd invest the difference, every single month, without exception, as automatically as paying a bill. If owning that house would have cost him $2,500 a month all in, and renting cost him $1,700, he'd try to invest the extra $800. Not perfectly. That's what made it real, and what made it hard. Some months, he invested the full $800, transferring it the same day his paycheck landed, before he could talk himself out of it. Some months it was $500, because a friend's wedding meant a flight and a gift and a hotel room. Some months it was nothing at all, because his car needed new brakes, or his rent went up again at renewal, or his laptop died right before a work deadline and he had to replace it immediately, or he flew home for a family emergency that drained his checking account for weeks. Life kept happening the way it always does, indifferent to spreadsheets and 5-year plans. But whenever he could, he invested. Not chasing hot stocks or trying to time some perfect trade. Not reading forums looking for the next big winner. Just steadily buying into broad, boring, diversified index funds and letting them sit, mostly untouched, mostly unwatched. By the time Leo turned 28, his friends started buying houses. One, then another, almost like a chain reaction moving through his friend group. Their social media filled up with closing day photos, keys held up in front of new front doors, captions about finally being homeowners, about paint colors and first barbecues in new backyards. Leo was happy for them, genuinely. But quietly, sitting alone scrolling through his phone, he felt like he was falling behind in some race he hadn't realized he was running. At a dinner one night, a friend asked him when he was finally going to buy. Leo laughed it off and said he was still renting. His friend shook his head, not unkindly either, and told him he needed to stop wasting money on something he'd never own. Leo didn't argue. He changed the subject, ordered another beer, let the conversation move on. But that night, alone in his apartment, he opened his investment account and looked at a number that didn't feel impressive at all, especially compared to the home values his friends kept casually mentioning. For the first time, he genuinely wondered if everyone else had been right about him. A few years passed, and housing prices kept climbing, faster than anyone had predicted. Leo watched his friends' homes go from $300,000 to $350,000, then $400,000, seemingly without effort on their part. Their houses were becoming more valuable, in a way that felt real and physical, something you could point to, walk through, photograph. Leo had numbers on a screen that fluctuated up and down in ways that felt abstract, and, some weeks, almost fake. On paper, he was investing steadily. Emotionally, he felt like he was losing, watching everyone else's net worth climb through an asset he'd chosen to walk away from. Then his rent went up again. And again, the following year, and Leo started thinking that maybe he should have bought 5 years earlier, before prices ran away from him entirely, before the gap between renting and owning stopped looking like a choice and started looking like a mistake he'd made and could never undo. This was the moment Leo came closest to giving up on the whole plan. His friends were building equity in something solid, something you could stand inside and touch. Leo was still paying rent every month, with nothing physical to show for it, just a login page and a fluctuating number. One night he talked to his father on the phone, who told him he wasn't saying buying was always better. He was saying Leo needed to build something. Something lasting. Something with his name on a deed. That landed hard. Harder than any of the earlier comments had. For the first time in years, Leo seriously considered buying. He spent weekends touring houses. Got pre-approved. Found a place he genuinely liked, close to work with a small yard, and enough space for the life he still occasionally pictured. He got close enough to making an offer that his hands were sweating over the keyboard while filling out paperwork. And then he sat down and ran the numbers one more time, carefully, honestly. He realized what it would actually cost him, draining a huge portion of the investments he'd spent nearly a decade building, and locking himself into monthly expenses far higher than what he was comfortably paying now, at a moment when interest rates weren't in his favor. He walked away, not because buying was wrong, just because that particular house, at that particular moment, didn't fit the financial life he'd been quietly building, brick by brick, month by month. 15 years passed. Leo turned 40. His salary had grown along with his career. Through 2 job changes and a handful of raises he'd mostly reinvested, rather than spent. His investments had been compounding quietly the entire time. Through market dips he'd barely noticed, and recoveries he'd barely celebrated. Through years that felt uneventful, and years that felt frightening in the moment, and forgettable in hindsight. There was no crypto jackpot in his story, no lottery ticket stock, no single year of dramatic 40% returns he could point to. Just time, consistency, and a habit he'd never fully abandoned, even when it felt pointless. Even when his friend's home equity seemed to be winning by every visible measure. Sitting at that kitchen table in 2026, Leo finally did the math he'd avoided for years. He compared what would have happened if he'd bought that first house back at 25, home value today, minus the remaining mortgage balance, plus whatever equity he'd have built, minus interest paid over the years, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, repairs, transaction costs, and the opportunity cost of that original down payment sitting in the house instead of the market. Then he compared it against his actual path, renting, and investing the difference every month he could manage it. For the first time, he saw the complete picture, laid out in black and white. His friend's original house was now worth roughly $550,000. But once you subtracted the remaining mortgage and 15 years of costs, the real equity wasn't anywhere close to that headline number everyone quoted at parties. Leo's investment portfolio, quietly built out of $800 months and $500 months, and the occasional zero, had grown into something substantial too, larger than he'd let himself believe. During the years he doubted it. The gap between the 2 paths was far smaller than either of them would have guessed back at that dinner table years earlier, when one friend told him he was wasting money. Neither path was clearly the winner. Both had worked, in their own way, for the people who stuck with them. But then Leo noticed something uncomfortable in his own spreadsheet. His results weren't good because renting was better than buying. They were good because he had actually invested the difference, month after month, year after year. Even when it felt small, even when it felt pointless. If he'd rented for 15 years and spent those savings on nicer cars, more vacations, and a lifestyle that crept upward with every raise, he wouldn't be sitting here with anything to show for it. He would have simply been a renter with a good story about flexibility, and nothing in the bank to prove it mattered. The investing habit was the entire engine. Not the rent, not the mortgage, the habit. That's when Leo understood who the real enemy had been all along. It wasn't rent, and it wasn't a mortgage. It was lifestyle inflation, the quiet tendency for spending to rise every time income does, for a bigger paycheck, to become a bigger apartment, a nicer car, a house that's slightly more than you can comfortably afford, upgrades that feel earned but quietly erase the gains underneath them. The person who wins isn't automatically the homeowner. And it isn't automatically the renter. It's whoever consistently turns income into assets, instead of letting it evaporate into upgrades nobody really needed in the first place. Back in 2026, Leo was still renting, but he wasn't embarrassed about it anymore. He wasn't telling himself renting was better than buying. He was simply saying he understood exactly why he'd made the choice he made, and what it had cost and earned him along the way. He had flexibility to move for work without selling a house first. He didn't have to panic over a $15,000 roof replacement, or a furnace dying in January. And if he wanted to buy now, he was in a far stronger position to do it than he'd ever been, because he hadn't spent 15 years waiting for the perfect financial moment to start building wealth. He'd built it while actually living his life. So did Leo prove that renting makes you richer? No. Did his friends prove that buying makes you richer? Not necessarily either. There's no universal answer sitting at the bottom of this story, no matter how satisfying that would be. Someone who buys a reasonably priced home, stays for decades, keeps their expenses under control, and steadily builds equity can end up in a fantastic financial position. Someone who rents, invests consistently, and resists the pull of lifestyle inflation can end up just as strong, sometimes stronger. But someone who rents and spends every extra dollar, or someone who buys a house they can barely afford, and drowns in the costs around it, can struggle either way, regardless of which side of the debate they picked at 25. Renting doesn't make you rich. Buying doesn't make you rich. The wealth comes from what you do with the money left over after you pay for wherever you live. And that's the question Leo wished someone had asked him 15 years earlier. Not, are you renting or are you buying? But what are you actually doing with the difference?